Imagine you are standing in the middle of a green hell, a place where the air is so thick with moisture and the scent of rotting vegetation that you feel like you're breathing underwater. You are a United States Marine, part of the most powerful military machine the world has ever seen. You have the air support, you have the heavy artillery, and you have 41 brothers in arms standing right beside you. You feel invincible until a captain in a clean uniform tells you that for the next 72 hours, your life depends entirely on 4 men you've never met. Men who don't wear rank, don't use radios, and move through the jungle like they're part of the shadows. The Viet Cong don't fear your B-52s anymore. They've learned to dig deep and wait. Today we're going deep into the Phuoc Tuy province to witness the moment Lieutenant James Morrison realized that everything he knew about war was a lie. If you think numbers and firepower win battles, prepare to watch 42 elite Marines be humbled by 4 shadows with New Zealand accents who treat the jungle not as a battlefield, but as a sensory organ. This is how you become invisible before the enemy even knows you exist. The briefing room at Firebase Coral was a stifling box of corrugated metal and maps, the air vibrating with the distant rhythmic thud of outgoing 105mm howitzer fire. It was August 1969, a year when the war felt like it was grinding gears, stuck in a cycle of attrition that produced plenty of bodies, but very little ground. Lieutenant James Morrison of the 1st Battalion 5th Marines stood with his arms crossed, listening to a plan that felt like a personal insult. His platoon was being attached to a 4-man New Zealand SAS patrol for a deep reconnaissance mission. Morrison asked, his voice echoing the skepticism of a man who measured strength in platoons and companies. The intelligence officer didn't blink. He just stared at Morrison with eyes that looked like they hadn't seen sleep since the Tet Offensive. Morrison met the New Zealanders that evening as the long, orange shadows of the rubber trees began to stretch across the firebase. They didn't look like the elite snake eaters he'd expected. They looked like ghosts that had spent a lifetime in the mud. Their uniforms were a faded, salt-crusted olive drab that had lost any semblance of a sharp military crease. There were no unit patches, no bright silver bars of rank, no U.S. Marines stenciled across the chest. Their faces were already painted, not with the standard green and brown stripes the Marines used, but with chaotic, irregular blotches of black and dark earth tones that seemed to swallow the contours of their noses and jawlines. When Morrison looked at them, his eyes struggled to find a focal point. It was an optical illusion in human form. The patrol leader was a sergeant named Bill Thompson. He was wiry, his skin tanned to the color of old leather, with eyes that seemed to be constantly vibrating, scanning the perimeter even while he spoke. He didn't offer a salute. He didn't offer a hand. He just looked Morrison up and down and asked, "Right then, Lieutenant. How many of your boys have a habit of sneezing in the dark?" Morrison bristled, his pride as a Marine officer flaring up. "My men are professionals, Sergeant. We've operated at night plenty of times." Thompson's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, it was a twitch of grim realization. Quote 1. Before Morrison could defend his men, Thompson started the quote 2. It was a 4-hour process that Morrison would later describe as the most humiliating afternoon of his life. One by one, the Marines were called forward. Thompson and his teammates, Davies, Wilson, and Ross, went through their gear like surgeons removing a tumor. Quote 3 Thompson said, pointing to a Marine's chest. Corporal Davies barked at another Marine. They went through everything. Magazine pouches were stuffed with cloth to prevent the rounds from rattling. Bootlaces were taped down so they wouldn't snag on a thorn and snap back with a crack. Watches were turned inward so the glass wouldn't catch a stray glint of moonlight. Cigarettes were confiscated. Zippo lighters were buried. Even the smell of the men was addressed. Quote 7 Thompson noted, sniffing the air near a squad leader. Morrison watched his men, tough kids from Detroit, Philly, and Chicago, look at each other with a mix of confusion and growing respect. They were being stripped of their identities, of the things that made them, quote, 9 and being turned into raw material for the Ghost family. Then came the movement training. Thompson led Morrison and a few squad leaders into a small patch of jungle at the edge of the fire base. The sun was still up, but the canopy made it a world of perpetual twilight. Thompson said. He took 10 steps into the brush. Morrison watched intently, but he realized something halfway through. He wasn't hearing anything. Thompson's feet didn't just step, they flowed. He used a rolling heel-to-toe motion, his knees bent to absorb the impact. His foot would touch the ground lightly, feeling for a dry leaf or a twig, and only when he was sure the ground was silent would he commit his weight. He didn't push through the vines, he melted through the gaps. When he stopped 10 meters away, he hadn't broken a single twig. He hadn't even disturbed the dew on the leaves. "Your turn, Lieutenant," Thompson whispered from the shadows. Morrison tried. He was a fit, capable officer, but within 3 steps, a dry branch snapped under his boot with a sound that felt like a gunshot. Thompson appeared beside him instantly, his face a mask of neutral, terrifying calm. "You're walking like a soldier, Morrison. You're imposing your will on the jungle. You need to stop that. The jungle is a sensor array. Every leaf is a microphone. Every branch is a tripwire. You don't walk on the jungle, you negotiate with it. You feel before you commit. Speed is a luxury you cannot afford when you're outnumbered 10-1. We move at the speed of silence. If that means it takes us 4 hours to move 1 kilometer, then that's how long it takes. Because at the end of that kilometer, we'll be alive, and they'll be wondering where the ghosts went." As the training continued into the night, Morrison began to understand the psychological weight of this kind of warfare. It required a level of concentration that was exhausting. You couldn't just quote one on patrol. Every muscle in your body had to be tuned to the environment. You had to listen for the birds. If they stopped singing, something was moving. You had to feel the wind. If it shifted, your scent was being carried toward the enemy. Thompson taught them about light discipline that went far beyond flashlights. He explained how the human eye detects movement and symmetry. "Quote 2, he whispered. "Quote 3. By the time the clock hit 0300, the Marines were ready, or as ready as they would ever be. There was no quote for no heroic speech. They simply stood up, checked their gear one last time in the pitch black, and followed the 4 shadows out of the wire. The darkness was absolute. The triple canopy overhead blocked out the stars, leaving them in a void where even their own hands were invisible. Morrison felt a surge of panic. How could they move? How could they find the trail? But then he remembered Thompson's words, quote, 5. Slowly, the world began to resolve into shades of gray and deep indigo. The trees became darker shapes against a slightly lighter sky. The trail became a faint ribbon of flattened earth. They moved in a single file, 50 meters of space between each man to prevent a single grenade or burst of fire from taking out more than one person. The first hour was a test of nerves. Every time a lizard scurried across a leaf or a branch creaked in the wind, Morrison's heart hammered against his ribs. But the New Zealanders at the front were unflappable. They didn't just move, they seemed to sense the terrain before they even touched it. They navigated around hanging wait-a-minute vines that would have snagged a Marine's rucksack, and they stepped over tangled roots as if they had built-in sonar. Suddenly, Thompson raised his hand. The signal went back down the line like a silent wave. Everyone froze. Morrison held his breath, his ears straining against the silence. And then he heard it. Voices. Vietnamese voices, normal and conversational, coming from the darkness ahead. They were close, maybe 30 meters. A normal Marine patrol would have set up a hasty ambush, prepared for a firefight, and called in the coordinates for an artillery strike. But Thompson didn't move. He didn't even reach for his weapon. He just stood there, a shadow among shadows, and watched as a full squad of Viet Cong walked right past them, laughing and talking as if they were the only souls in the forest. Morrison felt a cold sweat on his neck. They were so close he could smell the tobacco from their hand-rolled cigarettes. He realized in that moment that Thompson was right. The VC felt safe here. They didn't think anyone was watching, and because they felt safe, they were making the biggest mistake of all. They were being loud. Thompson waited until the voices faded into nothingness. He waited another 10 minutes, ensuring no stragglers were following. Then he signaled to move. He didn't say a word, but the message was clear. We don't kill for sport, we kill for information. The hunt had truly begun. The air in the harbor position was like a stagnant pool, thick with the smell of damp earth and the metallic tang of weapon oil that hadn't been cleaned in days. We were deep into the 72-hour watch, tucked into a natural bowl of dense vegetation that overlooked a critical trail junction. This was the second stage of our education in ghost logic. For the Marines, accustomed to the rhythmic noise of a fire base, the hum of generators, the distant thunder of H&I, harassment and interdiction fire, the banter of the mess hall. The silence here was a physical weight. It was a silence so absolute that you started to hear the blood pumping in your own ears. Thompson had divided the time into rigid watch rotations. One New Zealander and 2 Marines were awake at all times, their eyes glued to the gaps in the foliage. The rest of us slept, if you could call it that. It was more like a state of controlled unconsciousness. You learned to sit with your back against a teak tree, your M16 across your lap, and drift into a shallow gray zone where part of your brain stayed wired to the forest's frequency. If a bird stopped mid-call or the wind shifted the grass in a way that didn't match the breeze, you were awake and lethal before your eyes even opened. No talking, Thompson had whispered directly into my ear when we first settled in. Not even a breath. If you have to communicate, you write it on a pad or use the hand signals I taught you. Your voice is a flare in the dark. Don't light it. By the second night, the exhaustion began to take on a hallucinatory quality. The shadows seemed to move on their own. The jagged leaves of the ferns looked like the serrated edges of bayonets. But then, the trail junction came alive. We watched through the green screen as a squad of NVA regulars drifted into the clearing. They were professionals. Proper uniforms, canvas webbing, SKS rifles slung over their shoulders. They weren't laughing like the local VC we'd seen earlier. They moved with a grim, purposeful stride. I felt Corporal Hayes, sitting 3 feet to my left, tensed like a coiled spring. I knew what he was thinking. We had the high ground. We had the surprise. We could have opened up with a coordinated volley and wiped them out before they knew they were in a kill zone. It was the American way. Find, fix, finish. But I looked at Thompson. He wasn't even touching his trigger. He was holding a small, weathered notebook, his pencil moving in a ghost-like crawl across the paper. He was counting. He was noting the unit insignia on their pith helmets. He was documenting the direction of their march. He was treating the enemy like a science experiment, not a target. An hour later, a lone courier came down the trail. He was young, maybe 19, his face gaunt in the moonlight. He stopped just 20 meters from our position, so close I could see the frayed edges of his collar. He sat down on a rotted log and fumbled with a pack of cigarettes. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. In the silence, it sounded like a drum. I was certain the boy would hear it. I was certain he'd look up and see the glint of my eyes. Then, I saw Thompson move. It was the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed. He didn't stand up. He didn't make a sound. He simply slid out of his position like a snake moving through silk. Over the course of 15 minutes, he covered 10 meters of jungle floor. He didn't crawl. He flowed. He moved so slowly that the eye almost couldn't register the transition. He positioned himself directly behind a screen of ferns, less than 5 meters from the NVA courier. The boy finally got a match lit. In that brief, flickering flare of orange light, I saw Thompson's face. He was staring right at the back of the courier's head. He had a knife in his hand, the blade blackened with soot to kill any reflection. He could have ended that boy's life in a heartbeat. He could have reached out and touched his shoulder, but he just sat there, motionless, a phantom in the tall grass. The courier took a long, shaky drag of his cigarette, oblivious to the fact that death was sitting close enough to smell his breath. He finished his smoke, crushed the ember into the dirt, and continued down the trail. Only then did Thompson retreat, sliding back into our perimeter with the same eerie fluidity. I crawled over to him, my hands shaking. I leaned in until our foreheads almost touched. Quote zero quote, I breathed, the word barely a vibration in the air. Quote one quote. Thompson's eyes were cold, like two chips of flint. He didn't answer immediately. He waited until the sound of the courier's footsteps had completely vanished. Then he leaned in. One dead courier creates a search party, he whispered. A search party creates alertness. Alertness ruins the mission. Better to let him think he's alone. A safe enemy is a lazy enemy. A lazy enemy is how we find the base camp. It was a cold, hard logic that bypassed the ego. As Marines, we were taught that every dead enemy was a point on the scoreboard. But for the New Zealanders, a dead enemy was often a tactical failure. They wanted the big picture. They wanted the why and the where, not just the how many. On the third day, the why appeared. A full NVA company, over 100 men, marched into the junction. This wasn't a patrol. This was a relocation. They were carrying heavy mortars, crates of ammunition, and rolls of communications wire. They set up a temporary rest halt right in front of us. They were so confident in their security that they started heating rice on small, smokeless stoves. The smell of jasmine rice and fish sauce drifted up into our bowl, a cruel torture for men who had been eating cold, dry rations for 70 hours. Thompson's team went into a frenzy of silent documentation. Corporal Davies had a camera with a massive telephoto lens, the shutter muffled by a thick piece of foam. He photographed every officer's face. He photographed the serial numbers on the mortar tubes. Trooper Wilson was mapping the heavy weapon emplacements they were discussing, while Ross used a high-gain microphone to capture the whispered orders of the company commander. We were sitting on a gold mine of intelligence. If we had engaged, we would have been overrun in minutes. We would have died in a, quote, 8 last stand that changed nothing. But by staying silent, by being ghosts, we were gathering the information that would eventually allow a B-52 strike to wipe out that entire company and their base camp in one surgical blow. Thompson noted on a scrap of paper he passed to me. I looked at the NVA soldiers. They were disciplined, yes. They were brave, surely. No они были, quote, одиннадцать. They were following a routine. They were occupying a space. Thompson and his men weren't occupying anything. They were part of the space. There is a profound difference between being in the jungle and being of the jungle. By the time the sun began to dip on the final day, the physical toll was starting to break some of my men. Dehydration was setting in. Their eyes were bloodshot, their skin caked in a layer of red dust and dried sweat. But no one complained. Not a single man reached for a canteen without checking the silence first. Not a single man shifted his weight without feeling for a twig. They had been transformed. They weren't the loud, boisterous Marines who had walked out of Firebase Coral. They were becoming shadows. Hayes, the kid from Detroit who had been the most skeptical, looked at me and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He had it. He finally understood that the most dangerous thing you can be in a war isn't the guy with the biggest gun. It's the guy the enemy doesn't even know is there. As the light faded into that deep, bruised purple of the Vietnamese twilight, Thompson gave the signal. Extraction. But we weren't just going to walk back. We had to pass through the same trail junction that was now a highway for enemy reinforcements. The tension was so thick, you could have cut it with a K-bar. Every shadow was a potential ambush. Every rustle of a leaf was a heart-stopper. But as we stood up to move, I realized I didn't feel the same fear I'd felt on the way in. I felt a strange, cold clarity. I looked at the New Zealanders, their silhouettes blending perfectly into the vertical lines of the trees. They weren't just our guides anymore. They were our architects. They had built a new version of us, one that didn't need to shout to be heard. We stepped out of the bowl and into the black. No flashlights, no radios, just 46 ghosts moving through a graveyard. The final push back to Firebase Coral was a masterclass in slow-motion terror. We weren't just moving through the jungle anymore, we were navigating a hornet's nest that had been stirred but hadn't quite realized it yet. The NVA company we'd spent hours documenting had moved off, but they'd left a wake of __quote_0____ pickets, scouts and snipers meant to catch exactly what we were, intruders in their backyard. Thompson led us not through the open trail, but through the __quote__1___ terrain, the thickest, most vine-choked ravines where even the local VC wouldn't bother to tread. It was brutal. Every step was a negotiation with 1,000 thorns. We moved in a staggered column, the silence so dense it felt like it was pressing against our eardrums. My Marines, men who usually hummed Motown hits or bitched about the heat, were now moving with a haunted precision. They had seen Thompson almost touch the enemy. They had seen that the only thing standing between them and a body bag was the hacksaw logic of silence. About 2 kilometers from the firebase, the wind shifted. The scent of wood smoke and boiled rice, the unmistakable smell of an NVA cook site, drifted across our path. Thompson froze. His fist went up and 45 shadows behind him vanished into the ferns. For 20 minutes we didn't breathe. Through the gaps in the bamboo, I saw the flicker of a small fire. An NVA checkpoint. They were right on our extraction route, sitting in the one bottleneck we had to pass to reach the rubber plantation. I crawled up to Thompson. I could see the sweat beading on his camouflaged forehead, the only sign of the pressure he was under. I tapped my M16 and gestured toward the fire. A quick, violent strike. We could overrun them in seconds. We had the numbers. Thompson looked at me, his eyes 2 cold chips of obsidian. He shook his head slowly. He pointed toward a massive, rotted banyan tree that overhung a nearby stream. He wasn't going to fight them. He was going to lead 42 Marines right underneath their noses through a waist-deep swamp that smelled like a sewer. It took us 3 hours to cover 400 yards. We waded through black, stagnant water, our boots sinking into knee-deep muck that tried to suck the soles right off. We moved with the pace of a glacier. If a Marine slipped, 2 others caught him before he could splash. If a pack strap creaked, a hand was there to muffle it. We passed so close to the NVA checkpoint that I could hear the clink of their metal spoons against their bowls. I could hear one of them coughing, a wet, hacking sound that echoed in the humid air. We were ghosts. We were the ghost family now. When we finally broke through the perimeter wire at Firebase Coral, the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, turning the sky a bruised, angry red. The sentries at the gate didn't even see us at first. We simply materialized out of the mist, 46 mud-caked specters returning from the dead. The debriefing was a whirlwind. The intelligence officers were ecstatic. The photographs Davies had taken identified a high-level NVA headquarters that had been elusive for months. The recordings Ross had captured provided the exact timetable for a major offensive planned for the following week. Based on our data, a massive B-52 strike was coordinated within 48 hours. It didn't just disrupt the enemy, it erased them. 100 men we'd watched eating rice were gone, along with their mortars and their communications wire, in a surgical strike that left no American fingerprints on the ground. 2 days later, the 4 New Zealanders were prepping to leave. They looked exactly as they had when they arrived, faded, nameless, and unimpressed. Thompson was sitting on a crate, sharpening his blackened knife with a small whetstone. The screech of the stone was the only sound in the quiet morning. I walked over to him, my own uniform still stained with the red dust of the Phuk Tui bush. I didn't know how to say thank you. Quote 1. I started quote 2. Thompson stopped sharpening. He looked up at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something like respect in those hard eyes. Quote 3. He stood up, sheathed his knife, and adjusted his bush hat. Quote 4. I watched them board the transport, 4 shadows disappearing into the belly of a machine. They didn't look back. They didn't need the credit. They were moving on to the next patch of green hell, to the next 72-hour watch, to the next silent negotiation with death. I went back to my platoon. I found Corporal Hayes sitting in the dirt, surrounded by a group of younger Marines. He wasn't telling them stories about firefights or heroic charges. He was showing them how to tape their dog tags. He was showing them how to move their feet, heel to toe, so the dry leaves wouldn't betray them. Hayes said, looking up as I approached. I looked at him, a tough kid from Detroit who had finally learned that silence is a weapon more powerful than any artillery battery. I nodded. __quote _7 __. I realized then that my tour hadn't really started until I met the Ghost family. I had arrived in Vietnam as an officer of the most powerful military on Earth, but I was leaving as a hunter. I understood now that in the triple canopy darkness, the most dangerous thing you can be is invisible. The story of the joint patrol became a legend among the 1st Battalion. Other officers called it the quiet mission. But to me, it was the moment I realized that war isn't just about who has the most lead, it's about who has the most patience. It's about the man who is willing to sit in the dirt for 3 days, inches from the enemy, and wait for the perfect moment to fade away. I never saw Thompson or his team again, but every time I find myself in a situation where the odds are stacked against me, where the noise of the world is screaming for me to act, I remember the screech of that hacksaw and the silence of that trail junction. I remember to breathe. I remember to feel the ground before I step. And I remember that ghosts don't carry cigarettes or wear shiny watches. We were the elite, yes. We were United States Marines. Но в тот месяц, в той красной пыли, ну и дата, мы стали чем-то большим. We became the Ghost family. And for the rest of my life, every time I walk through a quiet forest, I'll be looking for the shadows, because I know that just because you can't see them doesn't mean they aren't there, watching, waiting, and documenting every move you make.